You are listening to episode 15 of the Foley and James podcast. This week I sit down with a very good friend of mine, Oliver St.John, who also happens to be a master in international and European relations. Or at least he will be upon completion of the master's degree he's currently studying at the University of Linköping in Sweden. Born in the UK but holding German citizenship, Ollie is very active within politics, being a member of the German Social Democratic Party, as well as appearing on the board of directors of the Swedish Association of International Affairs, which consists of over 4,000 members. The Swedish Association of International Affairs is a politically neutral organisation, and as such, I've been asked to point out that any views and opinions voiced in this episode by Oliver are his own, and for the purposes of this episode, he is not representing the association in any capacity. This was a wonderful episode to record. I learned a lot from Ollie's unique and international perspective. We cover the founding of the EU, go in depth on the Brexit vote, exactly why a second referendum does not seem to be on the cards, and we even find solutions for achieving world peace and fixing the issues that arrive within democracy itself. So if you're like me and don't have much knowledge about politics, but have had your ears pricked at everything to do with Brexit and the EU over the last couple of years, this is definitely an episode not to miss. So sit back, relax, and enjoy this fascinating conversation. Alright Oliver, so why don't we just begin, dive straight in. What are your thoughts on Brexit?
I personally am very disappointed that the UK decided to leave the European Union. One of the main reasons why I'm disappointed that the UK left the EU is because a lot of people don't realise why the EU was originally formed. So in 1950, Robert Schuman, who was the French Foreign Minister, issued the Schuman Declaration. The declaration proposed that, I quote, Franco-German production of coal and steel as a whole be placed under a common high authority within the framework of an organisation open to the participation of other countries of Europe. End of quote. This European coal and steel community had the responsibility to organise and maintain a common coal and steel market which prohibited national trade barriers for coal and steel. The principal aim of the European coal and steel community was to create solidarity in production between Germany and France, and as a consequence make war between the two nations, I quote, materially impossible. The European coal and steel community was created in order to create peace within Europe, a continent that had suffered two big wars within a very short period of time. And in international relations, there are a number of theories. And one of the theories is liberalism. And within liberalism, there is what is called interdependence. And the idea is that countries, through trade, can become dependent upon one another. And if they are dependent upon one another, it makes it disastrous for either of the countries to go into war with one another. And this is the reasoning behind the foundation of the European coal and steel community.
Can I just interrupt you there, because that's an interesting point you bring up. I actually spoke with a German relatively recently, and he's the only non-Brit that I ever met who was staunchly pro-Brexit, and I asked him why, and the reason he said is because he thinks that the smaller the factions, the more broken up and the smaller these countries are, the better it is. It's because you're dependent on each other. For example, he's from Bavaria, and he's very much for Bavaria branching off from Germany itself and becoming its own independent state, and not because he is insular and wants to be isolated from the rest of the world like a lot of people would think that mindset is for, but because of exactly what you just said. It's because when you're that small, you have to rely on other people. You have to have these open relationships with other countries in order to function properly within the modern world. I mean, that's almost... would that not be true? Would that not work?
But you say he was pro-Brexit?
He was pro-Brexit because we've got the European Union as a big one mass, and he was pro-Brexit because he was saying break the UK away, break up the EU back into its smaller countries so that they are then dependent on each other more and on the other countries in the rest of the world. Whereas the EU as a whole, I think he was looking at it as one big country in a sense, and therefore it's very self-sufficient and self-sustaining. Whereas he was very much for breaking off into factions, into sectors, and meaning that you're dependent on each other. Because what you just described there is what he said, isn't it? But isn't the EU bringing people together and getting rid of borders and making one big country?
No, so I'm really confused by that, actually, to be honest. So the EU is basically sovereign states that come together in a supranational organisation. And yes, there is some political integration as well. But the original thought behind the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community was to make the countries dependent on one another for coal and steel.
I understand that, but if you're a tiny country, let's say, for example, Scotland broke away from the UK, right? So you've got this tiny population of people now that are now a complete sovereign state, independent.
Yeah.
Now, on their own, if
they wouldn't be part of the EU. Are you saying on their own?
I know. If they were on their own, Scotland was an independent sovereign state, they were completely on their own and had no ties to any other countries, they wouldn't be able to do very much. They don't have, they're not big enough to have all the resources you need to run a successful modern day country to the level that, let's say, the US is, which is obviously a huge country. But by having them that small, and with that risk being that they would isolate themselves, they would therefore have to be more open to connections with other countries, and therefore having a smaller country almost forces you to be more open because you need other people then to help you. That was his point.
Well, by leaving the EU, I think the UK has shown itself as a very isolated country that isn't willing to become closer to other nations.
That's the impression I get too. It just seemed interesting. He was suggesting that there should be no EU. He wanted the EU to be gone and that it goes back to being France, Germany, Holland, Luxembourg, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, all of these not related by any sort of super organisation like you mentioned, and maybe even going even smaller and separating Germany off into Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, whatever. And then those very small tribes almost will be super reliant on everyone else. And would that not bring people closer together? That was his argument. I'm just trying to put that out there because I'd never heard it before, and I just wanted to get your point of view on it because I know nothing about politics. That's all.
Yeah. So James, if you think back to the 19th century, early 20th century, that's the situation that we had in Europe, and then we had the First World War, the Second World War, which were both devastating. But then we had the foundation of the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952. And how many wars have there been between the member states since 1952?
I assume none, isn't it?
Zero.
Yeah.
Zero. So that's why I don't understand his argument at all.
Do you think then that it would just result in more tension and more likelihood of disagreement and therefore warring factions in that
Definitely.
case?
I mean, I think history is the best evidence in this case. Like I said,
that makes sense.
There's been no wars at all since 1952 between the member states.
That's true. That's not to say that they haven't been involved in wars, though. I mean, they have been fighting the EU. I mean, obviously, we've been fighting other countries.
No, but I said wars between.
I know.
Yeah.
But we have been fighting wars, so it's not that that's stopped. And could it just be that the EU has stopped the wars within each other, but it hasn't stopped this mentality of war and this mentality of, attacking? Like, would you suggest that maybe having some sort of global union on a same kind of system as the EU would be a way to eradicate war, do you think? I mean, forget how logistically ridiculously hard that would be with the different political views of countries and cultures and stuff, but if you could have the EU but every country in the world, do you think that would be the end of war?
So if we're talking about liberals, and when I say liberals, I mean liberals in international relations theory, I mean that's the ultimate dream, to have a world government, to create interdependence between countries in order to prevent wars from happening. However, a lot of people know that it is unrealistic that will happen anytime soon. But it's an interesting point that you bring up, because again, if we go back to liberal theory, there's a part of the liberal theory which is called the democratic peace theory. And that's the theory that democracies don't go to war against other democracies. So, and this has been backed up with empirical evidence as well, with a few exceptions.
So, but on the whole, it seems to be that democracy is a peaceful political ideology. Is that what you're saying? Or that makes sense, of course. I'm just trying to.
Yeah.
understand?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying.
Alright, so let's bring it back to the present day. That's a wonderful overview of the history of the EU, because I'm sure there's plenty of people listening who will have voted in a referendum and won't necessarily have known the history. I certainly didn't. But let's bring it back to the referendum itself, okay? I've got friends who are British but live in Germany, and they were there around the time of the referendum. And at that time they started applying and got approved for German citizenship, right? As a sort of, Britain's leaving but I want to stay in the EU, I'm just going to get rid of my British citizenship and get a German one. And I just wanted to think about, what do you think of people who did that as the reason they did that was a direct reaction to the result of that vote?
I completely understand that, and I completely respect it as well. And if I didn't have a German passport, I would have certainly done the same thing myself.
Because it's interesting, because you are someone who was born and raised in the UK, but you don't have the British passport, like you said. And am I right in saying you actually had a choice between British, German, and Irish at the time when you chose German?
Yeah, so I chose the German passport.
Why did you go for German?
Because I grew up with my mum, who is German, so I guess there was always that influence like that.
Because I want to point out that you did this way before any of this came up with the Brexit thing. You're not one of the people who's done that as a reaction to Brexit. You've been a German citizen for years now, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. But back to the point that you mentioned before, there's actually a MEP, so that's member of the European Parliament. He's called Guy Verhofstadt. I apologise for my pronunciation of that. He's a Belgian MEP, and he's the chief Brexit negotiator of the European Parliament. And he's actually fighting for British citizens to be able to retain some form of European citizenship.
Oh, is this the opt-in thing where we might be able to pay an annual fee and that allows you to have an EU subscription, essentially?
Yeah, there's not... he hasn't released any detailed information about it as of yet.
Is that still in the works though? Because I heard about it back last year when the result came in, and I haven't really heard anything about it since.
Yeah, he's still fighting for that, and he wants young people, well, all people of the UK, to be able to retain their ties to the EU. And this is one avenue, so to say, that he's considering.
And do you think that's likely to happen? Do you think that's likely to be a law or an allowance that's pushed through?
So he's, like I said, he's the chief Brexit negotiator of the European Parliament, and the European Parliament actually has a vote on whatever deal is agreed between the EU and the UK. So the European Parliament can actually vote to veto any such agreement.
Right.
So therefore, all politicians of Europe would be wise to consider what the European Parliament wants out of this deal.
Interesting. That's very interesting. I know you're disappointed with the Brexit result, but are you happy that you're no longer technically British in light of what's been going on over the last year?
I mean, I wouldn't say that I'm happy to not be British. I mean, I'd also like to consider myself as a European citizen rather than just a German citizen.
And why do you prefer to consider yourself that over a citizen from a singular country?
I don't know, it's very complicated for me to explain. I mean, if someone asked me where you're from, I'd still say I'm from Germany, but I still feel, as well as German, I also feel European. Just because of the fact that I have got a German mother, Irish father, and I was born in the UK.
Let's talk about the actual result of Brexit itself, okay? It was very tight, right? The big headline was 52% voted for Brexit and 48% voted for the EU, right? But that's quite a misleading headline, actually. Well, first of all, let's forget that politicians then in England continue to say the vast majority or the overwhelming victory when it wasn't. It was 2% over the half. But when you look at that in itself, only 72% of the population came out to vote. So that 52% is 52% of the people who voted, which if you take that as a whole of the population, only 37% of the British or UK population voted for leaving the EU. So I wanted to get your opinion on what you think about such a huge change in British history, or in any country's history, happening as a result of the will of just over a third of the population. Surely that's not democracy.
That's an excellent point that you bring up, and you're right to feel annoyed about that, but unfortunately that is how democracy works. In some countries, for example in Australia, there is a law that stipulates that you have to turn up to vote. So you can decide to vote blank, i.e. destroy your ballot, but you still have to turn up to vote.
Well, I wanted to bring that up actually because I thought of that as an idea, because why couldn't we have those 28% of people that decided not to vote at all? How can we tackle that problem? Would there be an option of maybe making it a law? But then that's forcing to vote, and that's maybe problematic as well. I didn't know that there are countries where that is a law, so maybe it is more possible than I thought. But the solution I came up with, would it not be possible to assume that anyone who doesn't vote doesn't want? Can we not say that, okay, if you don't come and vote, you'll be your tick, there'll be a tick mark next to not changing, right? So for example, in the Brexit referendum, you're not voting, that'll be one mark against staying in the EU. Or in the latest general election, if you didn't vote, we assume you're okay with the Conservatives staying in power, and so your name will go next to them. And if you don't want that to be the case, would that not then encourage those 28% of people who possibly did it just because they couldn't be bothered? Would it not encourage them to go if they know that their vote is? It would at least make them consider what they really think. If they know that their vote is going to be, their name's going to be forced to one way if they don't do it. Does that make sense? Or they could go to the. It might encourage more people to go to the voting booths and actually participate. For that, I do believe that yes, they should have an option of none of the above, or they can spoil the ballot, and so they're in that way they're not voting. But I still feel that it's important to take part in the process. Would that be a possible solution to that?
I don't think that is a solution, to be honest, because I think that could create a dangerous situation where the current government will always remain where the current party will always remain in power. So some people, unfortunately, just don't care about politics, they don't care about elections, and they won't turn up unless they are fined if they don't turn up.
Let's take that 28% of people that didn't vote in Brexit just as an example. If what I said was implemented, and if you don't vote, then you're essentially voting not to change, right?
Yeah.
How if that rule came in, do you think how much do you think that 28% figure would change?
I really can't say, but I reckon there would be.
Do you not think it would encourage people to go and vote more? I would have thought that figure would drop dramatically. I agree with you saying that there's obviously going to be people who just don't care and won't bother, but I don't think it's 28% of the population.
No, but I do believe it would be over 10%.
Really? Okay.
And I think that's a lot. So of course it would encourage some people to go out and vote, but some people just don't care, and it wouldn't be fair, it wouldn't be democratic if their votes would automatically go to the status quo. For example, whether that's the Conservatives in the UK or whether that's Remain for the referendum.
Okay, so what about bringing in a law? The reason I didn't consider that was because I thought that would be undemocratic, forcing that upon someone. But if Australia, I don't know, is first world politically correct? I don't know, but a first world country is implementing that. Is that not an option? Would that not be a better way of doing this to stop, massive shifts in the history of a country based on the views of a minority, which it was just over a third.
Yes, it's definitely one solution, definitely. But you've also got to consider, do you want someone who really doesn't care about politics, who doesn't know anything about politics, to go out and vote and put in a random vote?
I think there are enough people that do that already that are totally uninformed, myself included. I remember speaking with you a few years ago when we were both in Germany, about how I'd never voted at that point in my life. I'd never voted until then, and my reason for that was because I am uninformed, I'm not interested in politics, I know nothing about it, and I don't think it's right. I don't feel that my vote is valid if I just go and put a tick next to someone's name, because I felt uninformed. And I remember you looked at me quite sadly and shook your head and like, no, you should vote. But my point was that I don't know anything, and I feel like it's almost a misguided vote, because I'm just doing exactly what you said, just putting a cross next to any name. So what would be the reason for just, even if I'm uninformed, going and voting, because I think that would happen. That happens regardless of whether you instate a law or not. There are plenty of people that vote that just do it because, I heard that this party doesn't like foreign people coming in, and I don't like foreign people, so I'm going to do that. They're not looking at the fact that this party is involved in a lot of other things that are actually very detrimental to society. Not that excluding foreigners isn't detrimental, but you know what I mean.
I mean, it's a good point that you bring up, and unfortunately there are too many people who are uninformed, and I guess that is also the education system within the respective countries that are responsible for that.
Yeah, I mean, I never had a politics lesson at school, and I know for a fact that in Germany they do, for example, and young people are more politically active, at least in my experience, in Germany than they are in the UK, and that might have something to do with the education system.
Exactly, like, I was going to say the same thing, like, until I was 16, I had never had a politics class in the UK whilst I was in school in the UK.
Yeah.
And it was only when I started my A-levels and I actually had the option to choose politics, but that's also like a debate as to whether direct democracy is a good thing. So, for example, let's use the example of the UK, it's an indirect democracy. So we vote for MPs to take decisions on our behalves. However, every now and again, there is the option for direct democracy, which is a referendum, for example.
Right.
So that was the referendum to decide whether the UK stays or leaves the EU is a form of direct democracy. However, there's the question, is direct democracy a good thing? And the thing is, the vast majority of people did not understand what the EU does. And if you look at the statistics of the most searched terms on Google the day after the Brexit referendum, within the top 5 was, what is the EU, what does the EU do?
Really? The day after? The day after?
Yeah, the day after the referendum. And this is people deciding whether their country should remain in the EU or leave the EU.
So people are or were uninformed. They were voting without fully having the information. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly, yeah. And the politicians were also at fault for this. They weren't presenting the correct arguments.
Well, not only were they not presenting, they weren't giving the people the information, they were also giving them the wrong arguments. They were misinforming people directly. I mean, the most popular or the most famous one that comes to mind is the Leave campaign with their big red Brexit bus that had, we send £350 million, is it a week or a month to the EU? We could fund our NHS instead. That's our National Health Service that is, in dire need of money. There are a lot of people who voted Leave based on that one thing, and I completely understand that. I'm a massive proponent of the NHS. It's wonderful that we have universal healthcare here, But then the day of the result, Nigel Farage, who was the UKIP party leader and the main face of the Leave campaign, that was one of the first questions that was posed to him, and not only did he say that's not going to happen, he denied ever that was a promise or that was even a thing, that was even part of their campaign. And there are plenty of photos of this huge double-decker big red bus saying that. I mean, they're just lying at this point. Is that not true?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that was a lie, and also how it was formulated. We give this much money to the EU, but what wasn't taken into consideration was that the UK also gets a lot of money back in funding from the EU.
Off the top of your head, do you know roughly what the comparison would be? So if we give 350 million a month to the EU, what we roughly get back,
So no, I don't know what that is off the top of my head, but what I can tell you is that the UK has a special deal with the EU, which other countries don't benefit from. It's called the UK rebate, and it's basically a mechanism which reimburses 66% of the UK's budgetary imbalance. So that means the difference between payments and receipts. So let's say that the UK has given £100 to the EU, and it only receives £50 back from the EU, then the UK will be reimbursed 66% of that £50.
Of the difference, of the remaining difference, is that what you mean?
Exactly, yeah.
So that would be they'd get roughly an extra, £35 or something?
Exactly, so they'd be losing less money, so to say. But you have to take into consideration there were other countries that pay a significant amount of money to the EU budget, including Germany and France, and they don't benefit from such a rebate. This was a unique position that the UK was in.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't even know about that. That sounds even better. That makes that Brexit bus even more of a farce, you know?
Yeah, and not just that, there were a lot of exceptions for the UK in the treaties of the EU, where the UK didn't have to participate in certain activities of the EU. Whether, for example, if you remember, it was decided to divide the migrants that arrived in the EU between the EU countries.
Oh, in 2015, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. And the UK had the opportunity not to be involved in that programme, so they didn't have to take in any additional migrants, whereas other countries did.
Wouldn't that... So that's I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here for a second, because I'm pro-EU and I complete that, you know, it sounds amazing, but wouldn't that suggest that we've constantly gone to the EU and not really fully accepted what they're doing? We've always tried to get special treatment and stuff. Would that not suggest that actually Brexit probably is what we wanted? We never really wanted to be in there because we were always just, no, we don't really like that law. Can you do it like this? Can we have some money back? We don't really want to take the immigrants on. You know, could it be fair to say that you know, regardless of 37% of the population voted for leave, would it seem that actually Britain, the way we behave, shows that we didn't really want to be in the EU?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's always been a very controversial topic within the UK, but it was an amazing position that the UK was in. And if the UK were to ever to want to join the EU again, which I think it will in the future, if you consider how many young people voted in favour of staying in the EU, they're never going to be able to get that sort of deal again.
Right, it'll be a membership on the same level as a France or a Germany. It'll be full, no exceptions.
Exactly, no special deals for the UK. The UK can't be in a special position anymore.
Which I think is probably a good thing, because it should be all or nothing. You know, if you want to contribute, contribute. If you don't, then don't. We've been on the fence for however long. For us as British citizens, that's been wonderful because we get all the positives of the EU and you know, arguably none of the negatives, which, you know, selfishly is wonderful, but as far as being, you know, a contributing member, that's pretty poor.
I mean, I can also draw some benefits from the UK leaving the EU, but from an EU perspective.
Definitely.
So the UK has always been a barrier against further integration, against further cooperation. And now that the UK is leaving the EU, it looks like there's going to be greater defence cooperation, which the other EU member states have wanted for a long, long time. But it's been blocked by the UK every single time.
Only the UK? Like, is it a unanimous thing otherwise? Will it definitely happen?
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, it's only the UK that has been blocking further defence cooperation within the EU.
So that would be a benefit for the EU then, with the UK leaving, is that they could just go ahead and get that, because it sounds like the UK was the only one stopping it.
Exactly.
If you were in Britain now, if you're a British citizen in Britain, do you see Brexit being a good or bad thing for the UK?
I see Brexit as being a bad thing for the UK.
And what about for the EU?
And for the EU.
For both sides, you think it's a negative? Okay.
It's so important to remember why the EU was originally founded, and it has created peace within Europe. But not only that, it's created so much more. The European countries have become such good friends now. I mean, can you believe that it was only, 70 to 80 years ago that there was a war between all the major EU countries?
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. I've being in Luxembourg here, I've been to a couple of military museums and you know, learning about the Second World War and stuff. It's just unbelievable that it was so close. It wasn't that long ago.
But now these countries are such close partners, and I think that is a shame that Britain is, the UK, is isolating itself there.
Okay, so with that in mind, and we've discussed about voters being not only uninformed about what they're voting for, but misinformed intentionally by the politicians, I just want to use the general election for a second just to give you an example of what I'm going to make here for my final point about Brexit. So, despite stating that no snap general election would be triggered, Theresa May went back on herself and called one, saying that she wanted to show that she had strong support of the people behind her, so that she has a strong hand in the Brexit negotiations. So yesterday we had the election in the UK. It didn't go to plan for the Conservatives, maybe suggesting that people aren't all that certain about Brexit, as she insists on claiming, with the saying the majority of people, blah, blah, blah. But the Conservatives lost constituencies rather than gained them, and the results ended with no party receiving a majority of the votes, meaning we've ended up with a hung parliament. Now, there's lots of different things that can happen when there's a hung parliament, as far as I understand, and one of the things I read is that it could lead to a second general election being held if I think Theresa May decides not to try and run the country with a minority government and steps aside. So, isn't this an example of where a majority vote hasn't been found and a second vote is a viable option? Why is it then that with Brexit there was also no clear majority, but the mention of a second referendum seems to be blasphemous?
It's an interesting point, but you have to remember that it's two different voting systems. So for the general election, it's first past the post, and that's what's called a majoritarian voting system. So it is possible to get a majority of the seats in the House of Commons whilst only having 33, 34, 35% of the vote. What majoritarian systems tend to do is they tend to give the larger parties more seats than they should, proportional to their popular vote. So, it's even happened in the UK before, that there was one party who got the second highest number of votes, but that party then won the most seats in the House of Commons and could form the government.
How does that work?
It's due to the voting system. So if I'll try and explain it simply to you. So in the UK there's the first past the post voting system. So in each constituency, and there are 650 constituencies in the UK, in each constituency you vote for one MP to represent you in the House of Commons. And the party that has the most MPs in the House of Commons forms the government, in most cases.
And the leader of that party becomes the Prime Minister, right?
Exactly. However, let's imagine in the 650 constituencies, like I said, we're using Labour and Conservatives as an example here. So let's imagine that in each of the constituencies that the Conservatives won, they beat their nearest candidates by only 5 votes, 10 votes, 100 votes, etc. But in every one of the seats that Labour won, they won by 5,000 votes, 10,000 votes, etc. And then let's imagine that the Conservatives won in more constituency than Labour. That would lead to a situation in which the Conservatives have more seats in the House of Commons than Labour, but they have a lower share of the popular vote.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, got that.
So it's a very odd voting system that favours the larger parties. So in the UK, it is the Conservatives and Labour that profit from this voting system. Whereas the Greens, for example, they only won one seat in this election, but according to their vote share, they should have won more seats.
Oh, right. Interesting.
This first past the post voting system is the opposite of proportional voting systems. And in proportional systems, what tends to be the case is that if a party wins 30% of the votes, then that party will receive 30% of the seats.
Right. And that's what the Brexit vote was then, was it?
So the Brexit vote was a referendum where everybody has one vote, and whichever side of the referendum wins the most votes wins the referendum, so to say.
Yeah. So my example of why could there be a second general election but not a second vote it's because there's two different voting systems. So is it not reasonable still to have a second referendum, not based on the voting system, because it's two different voting systems, but based on the fact that it's now come to light that people were misinformed and uninformed with regards to their vote? Is that not a reasonable thing when it's direct democracy and it's the people, like as what you've just described, and it's the people who are voting directly for this change? Is it not unfair or immoral or possibly illegal to lie to them like that, to lie to people, and regardless of which side it was on. But the example is on the Leave campaign were lying to the people. Is it not? Why I don't understand why it's such a blasphemous thing to suggest a second referendum. When even Labour, who are pro-EU, is saying there won't be a second referendum.
Yeah, I agree with you there, James. I mean, I personally think there should be a second referendum based on how the original referendum was run. There weren't enough facts out there, and there were a lot of lies out there as well. But yeah, I agree with you that it's wrong that people are being criticised for suggesting a second referendum.
If you agree with that too, then I mean, you're not, you don't have political power within the UK, but why is it not being made more of a point? If it's not, I just thought I must be missing something here because I don't know about politics. But if that doesn't seem to be the case, why is it not being spoken about more?
And I can't answer that question, to be honest with you. I think it should be spoken about more, and I think there are a lot of people speaking about it on Facebook. I mean, I think the Liberal Democrats were willing to offer a second referendum. They were willing to offer the UK the opportunity to stay in the
They were, but
EU.
like you said, the voting system supports the two parties. The Lib Dems never had a chance of getting the government. Let's be honest now. But Labour were a pro-EU party. Jeremy Corbyn, their leader, is very pro-EU, but also...
No. So Labour is very pro-EU, but Jeremy Corbyn has never really been that pro-EU.
Oh, okay.
And you could tell that during the referendum campaign as well. He was campaigning very half-heartedly. He wasn't convinced. So I mean, that could be the answer to your question, James.
I think that might be the answer.
Jeremy Corbyn has never been a strong advocate of the EU. If it were a different leader of the Labour Party, I think Labour would have gone into this most recent general election saying we are going to offer a second referendum.
I mean, I'm just coming up with question after question here because there was a Labour Party vote. Was it after the referendum between, was his name Owen Wilson, I think, and Jeremy Corbyn? And Wilson offered a second referendum as part of his things, and Corbyn won by a landslide, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he won very convincingly. If the Labour Party is pro-EU, why did they not vote for the guy who is also offering a second referendum?
Hang on, let me just check the name, because Owen Wilson's an actor, but I...
Oh yeah, it was Owen Smith. Owen Smith is his name.
Owen Smith, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, not Owen Wilson. Forget that. But yeah, Owen Smith. Then why did Corbyn win that? So post referendum now, as far as we're concerned, we're leaving the EU. The Labour Party are electing a new leader amongst themselves. Why did Jeremy Corbyn, who is not that pro-EU, get elected so convincingly when Owen Smith was offering a second referendum showing that he was pro-EU, as is the ethos of that party?
So it has to do with the change of the membership rules that happened in the Labour Party. So the Labour Party allowed people to sign up as supporters of the party, and that gave them the right to vote in the leadership election. So if it had just been the core Labour members, I think it would have gone to Owen Smith. However, there was lots of people signing up to the Labour Party as supporters of the Labour Party who were very pro-Corbyn, who were very much in favour of his left-wing politics.
All right, that's cleared that up a little bit. That's good. But I'm right in thinking that at least, broadly speaking, the Conservatives are looking for what they call a hard Brexit, and Labour is possibly looking more soft. Is that accurate?
Yeah, along those lines, yeah. Hard and soft Brexit are very fixed categories, but there's a lot in between there as well.
Yeah, sure, I appreciate that.
But certainly Labour Party was looking for more of a softer Brexit and to retain closer economic ties.
Alright, there are so many questions I could ask you about Brexit because it's the first political thing that I've really got involved in, and I don't like the way it went, so I could argue about it for hours. But we're going to leave it there. I've taken enough of your time. Thank you so much for taking part in this, Ollie.
No worries. Thanks for having me, James.
And there you have it. If you enjoyed listening to Oliver and want to hear more from him again, Or if you want to agree or disagree with anything said in this episode, we want to hear from you. So get in touch and leave us a message on social media or send us an email to hammocks-are-life@gmail.com, because hammocks are life. If you want to show support for the podcast, simply give us a like or a share and go ahead and subscribe to us on YouTube or wherever it is that you are listening. I hope that you liked this week's episode, and until next time, bye!